Hello, and thank you for joining me once again tonight on my program. I want to minister tonight to those that you feel as though you really can't take another step, whether it be emotionally, physically, spiritually, financially. You feel as though the weight of the world is on your shoulders. If that's you, I want you to stay with me tonight. My title of the message is God Sends the Most Unlikely Resources. Sometimes we think we have God all figured out, but let's just see what God does. I want to go into 1 Kings chapter 17, and I'm going to be reading the first 6 verses. And Elijah the Tishbite of the inhabitants of Gilead said to Ahab, "As the Lord God of Israel lives, before whom I stand, there shall not be dew nor rain these years, except at my word." Then the word of the Lord came to him, saying, "Get away from here and turn eastward and hide by the brook Cherith, which flows into the Jordan. And it will be that you shall drink from the brook, and I have commanded the ravens to feed you there." So he went and did according to the word of the Lord, for he went and stayed at the brook Cherith, which flows into the Jordan. The ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning, and bread and meat in the evening, and he drank from the brook. Okay, let's look at God's resources for a minute that he told Elijah about. The brook, well, that was good. That was for fresh water. But if you're about to have a famine, what's the first thing that's going to dry up? The brook. So I might have thought to myself, I don't know. But okay, God, you told me to go to the brook. It's still, the famine hasn't even got good and started yet. There's still water, okay. But this thing about the ravens bringing me bread and meat twice a day, now I've never seen ravens bring me food before. You see, sometimes when God gives us our answer, it's in the most unlikely of all things. I always say it wouldn't come across my radar. It's not something I would have thought first. But Elijah, thankfully, he obeyed. So, this resource that Elijah received from God, the brook, and I'm not even hardly going to talk about the brook right now. I want to talk about those ravens. They brought bread and meat twice a day, breakfast and supper. They brought it to Elijah. Where'd they get it from? Well, you know, I don't think it was roadkill. I believe in my mind, and that's all it is in my mind, but I kind of like it. I believe those ravens flew right into the king's kitchen. I think that twice a day, those ravens went in there and got the freshest meat and the freshest baked bread right off the king's cupboard in the kitchen. I wouldn't be surprised if they didn't have guards posted. Those ravens, they keep coming in here. Put guards at the door to get those ravens out, and somehow we can't seem to keep them out. They just keep coming. And look, they're stealing the bread and they're stealing the meat. Twice a day they come. Just let me have my fun, folks. We do know somehow, from some source, they brought meat and bread to Elijah twice a day. Elijah had obeyed, and he didn't question God's ways. Remember, I said I might have questioned. Well, the brook is going to be the first thing to dry up, and I don't know about these ravens. You see, Elijah was smart. He had learned something very powerful that we as Christians need to learn today. We get tricked up and tripped up by questioning God's ways. We don't understand them. And therefore, we don't necessarily obey the word because it may be performed in a different way than we understand. We began to question His ways. We don't have to understand His ways. We just have to obey His word. Let me say it again. We don't have to understand God's ways, but we do have to obey His word. If you need a miracle, remember I said at the beginning of this, if you need a miracle for your healing, for your salvation, for your job, for your family, for your marriage, for your health, don't question God's ways, but obey His word tonight. Obey the word. Elijah did that. Let's go to Proverbs chapter 3, verse 5. And for this piece, I'm reading out of the Amplified Bible Classic Edition. Lean on, trust in, and be confident in the Lord with all your heart and mind. And do not rely on your own insight or understanding. Folks, how easy it is for us to try to rationalize things. We live in a world where we try to understand things, don't we? We always say, well, you just need to understand. And then you would understand. Folks, this word is beyond and it's higher, it's bigger than my understanding. And Jesus said to me, don't lean on your own understanding, but in all your ways acknowledge Him. When there's a difference between my understanding and His word, it's a no-brainer. I need to turn this brain off and I need to follow this word. And that's what Proverbs 3 and 5 is telling us to do. We need to do exactly what He tells you. An example that I love to use for that, we're going to take a break moment here and go into the New Testament, John chapter 2. We're going to look at the weddings. Once again, I would like to use the Amplified Bible for this one, Classic Edition. Chapter 2, verse 1. On the third day there was a wedding at Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Verse 2, Jesus also was invited with His disciples to the wedding. And when the wine was all gone, the mother of Jesus said to Him, they have no more wine. Verse 4, Jesus said to her, dear woman, what is that to you and to me? What do we have in common? Leave it to me. My hour to act has not yet come. Verse 5, His mother said to the servants, whatever He says to you, do it. Now, there were 6 water pots of stone standing there as the Jewish custom of purification, the ceremonial washing, demanded, holding 20 to 30 gallons apiece. Jesus said to them, fill the water pots with water. So they filled them up to the brim. Isn't that what Jesus told them, the servants to do? Then He said to them, draw some out now and take it to the manager of the feast, to the one that was presiding or the superintendent of the banquet. So they took him some. And when the manager tasted the water just now turned into wine, not knowing where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew, he called the bridegroom and said to him, everyone else serves his best wine first. And when people have drunk freely, and then he serves that which is not so good. But you have kept back the good wine until now. Do you see why it's so important, folks, to not lean on your own understanding? You know, I've taught on this one several times, I guess because it's one of my favorite of all-time miracles, because it teaches the steps on how to receive a miracle. But it's so important to do exactly what he says. The servants could have thought to themselves, and they could have spoken up to Jesus and said, Jesus, we've got all the water we need. There's still many more water pots over here. They're full. Why would you want us to go and get water? Jesus, your mother told you we're out of wine. We don't need water. But they didn't lean on their own understanding. They didn't question. There is no written notice here that says they opened their mouth. They did exactly what Mary instructed them to do, and that instruction is to you and it's to me. You do whatever he tells you. Quit leaning on your own understanding. Do whatever he tells you. I said the title of my message is Jesus brings in, God gives us the most unusual, unlikely resources. They went to the water well to get wine. I'd say that's pretty unlikely. What they did do was they trusted Jesus. But we try to reason with God before we ever step out in obedience. We sometimes argue back and forth like we knew better. What we're doing at that point is we're trusting in our five senses. God doesn't deal in the supernatural in those five senses, folks. He's going to blow your mind when it comes to a miracle because you can't figure it out. There's no way. It says those servants knew where they had got that from, that wine. It came from the water well. And they knew it had been water when they put it in those purification pots. They knew that. But that headmaster didn't. What he tasted was wine, the best he had ever tasted. If we begin to lean on our own understanding, we will miss miracle after miracle after miracle. We will reduce God's ability to work in our lives. You know, resources and miracles that we need are resources, whatever it is, whether it be a healthy body or financial. Another resource that I have dealt with people recently, a resource can be a lack of personnel, a lack of people behind you, a lack of support. Those that would get in there and say, yeah, go. Sure, we got you. We're praying with you. We're joining up with you. Sometimes that's a resource that you feel you don't have enough. When that becomes the case, I want you to reread, because it's another whole message, and I won't go there tonight, Gideon's army. God will explain that one to you. Whatever he gives you, that's enough, folks. I want you to understand that. Whatever he gives you, that's enough. Sometimes we need to be still until he tells us to do the next thing. You see, the servants, they didn't get ahead of God. They stayed. It doesn't say that they were doing anything until he spoke. Until he spoke. Now let's go right back into the Old Testament. Let's pick up in 1 Kings chapter 17. We're at verse 7. And it happened after a while that the brook, remember Elijah is now at the brook, it dried up because there had been no rain in the land. Verse 8, then the word of the Lord came to Elijah saying, arise, go to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon, and dwell there. See, I have commanded a widow there to provide for you. Okay, I want to connect the dots here. When God told me that last, he said, go to the brook. There was that nice flowing running water, and there were these ravens that came and they fed me twice a day. And God said, I've commanded those ravens to do this. I've said all the way through, nature doesn't argue with God. It's man that we have to struggle with. So if I'm Elijah, I'm wandering on, because he said he's got this widow woman that's going to be providing for me. If I'm in my own thought, I might think some things like this. A widow woman, Father, you sure you don't want to send me to a house where there's a husband, a provider? Because widows are usually the poorest among the lot. They don't have much. But God sent me, and so I'll go. Whatever He says, we need to go. Certain signs that we can see in our own eyes, that they would tell us God's intervention, when in fact, maybe God's intervention is for them versus us. God's very multi-purposed. I need you to understand that He does not do just one thing for somebody. He does multiple reactions. In this case, we're going to see where He helped Elijah and the widow woman and the little boy. Okay, God tells Elijah, arise, go to this town that belongs to this country and dwell there. See, I have commanded the widow there to provide for you. Commanded sounds like she's been told in her spirit, there's a prophet coming. And when he gets here, I want you to feed him. And that's what it sounds like. See, I have commanded the widow woman. Sounds like good news to me, just like He commanded those ravens. All right, let's get on into it. 1 Kings 17, verse 10. So he arose and went to Zarephath, and when he came to the gate of the city, indeed, a widow was there gathering sticks. Somehow in Elijah's spirit he knew, that's it, that's the woman, I see her. Look over there, she's gathering sticks. Wow, I'm going to have supper tonight. Been walking this distance. I got supper tonight, folks. I'm excited. In my mind, I see a good meal tonight. And so he talks to her. Verse 10, and he called to her and said, please bring me a little water in a cup that I may drink. And as she was going to get it, in other words, she's obeying, he called to her and said, please bring me a morsel of bread in your hand when you come back. Uh-oh, that was one thing too many. Let's look at verse 12 and see the woman's that God had commanded. Let's see what her reaction is. So verse 12, so she said, as the Lord your God lives, I do not have bread, only a handful of flour and a little jar of oil. And see, I am gathering a couple of sticks that I may go in and prepare it for myself and my son, that we may eat and die. Wow. Doesn't sound like the ravens to me. You know, the ravens, they got up and obeyed, but God said to Elijah, I've commanded her. Okay, whose report will you believe? Have you ever heard that phrase? Whose report you going to believe? God said, I've commanded her. She says, I don't have enough for you. It's kind of like, go away. I'm gathering these sticks. We're going to take this little bit of flour and this little bit of oil. I'm going to mix them together. I'm going to feed some to my son. I'm going to eat the last bite. We're laying down and we're dead. Wow. Doesn't sound like God's prepared anything. Whose report will you believe? Well, Elijah knew she had just spoken words of death. God said, I've got words of life. I have prepared life for you. Elijah believed God. Sometimes, well, let's just look at another teachable moment here. God was sending Elijah really for her. He could have kept water in that brook. He could have kept those ravens robbing the food out of the king's palace. This really wasn't about Elijah. He knew Elijah would obey his words. This was about a woman in desperation. That first move was for restoration. Elijah needed rest, and he needed to be pulled away, and God did that for him. But he has restored Elijah. God sent Elijah now to bring life to a widow woman and a little son. You see, sometimes we think our next move is about us getting more rest. And maybe this is you today. Maybe you just moved into an area, or you're going to a church or a community where you're thinking, they don't even seem like they want me here, but I know God told me to come here, but I don't see anything, and I don't feel blessed. Well, I can tell you right now, I don't think Elijah felt that blessed at that moment. But if you look at the whole picture, God really sent Elijah to bless her. Sometimes we are sent to be the blessing. Oh, God extended her that flour and that oil. God extended all of that. But Elijah was sent to bring words of life to her. Now, God knew she would obey. He had put that inside of her. As I said, He's a very multi-purposed God. So, one more very quick teachable moment here. When do we get the tightest in our giving? When do we get the, I don't want to say the word stingy, but tight with our giving? Isn't it when we feel like our resources are all gone or they're disappearing? And then suddenly, whoever our commitments were, maybe we had offered a pledge card to a church for missions, or maybe we had offered, maybe we were paying tithes, and suddenly, for whatever reason, things began to get tighter and tighter and tighter financially. And so we go to the pastor and say, you know, I just need to let go of that pledge. And we start paying less tithes than our 10%. One of the first places that we rob is the house of God, when we need Him the most, when we need to obey the most. God knows how to extend every penny you've got, and it can last right to the very last cent as long as you need it. Let's look at verse 12. So she said, as the Lord your God lives, I do not have bread, only a handful of flour in a bin and a little oil in a jar. And see, I am gathering a couple of sticks that I may go in and prepare it for myself, that I may eat and die. Wow. I feel as though I'm talking to someone tonight that's struggling with the same thing. Your resources are so low, your emotions are so tight, your sorrow is so heavy that you don't feel like you can give to anyone. Even though they cried out to you for help, you don't feel like you've got anything left. Now I'm speaking to this side of the house. You may feel like the widow woman. Don't ever turn God away. You see, Elijah told her, if you will get that little bit of flour and that oil, and you go in the house and you make it up, but I want you to bring me the first cake. You bring that one to me first. And then there will be enough for you and your son. But you got to bring me the first one. I said my title was God Sends the Most Unlikely Resources. Whether it's go and get some water for the pots because we need wine. Or if it's go cook the last of what you have, and then it won't be the last if you'll give God his portion first. You see, Elijah, that was the representation of giving God first, and then you use the rest. God will always extend what you have if you give to him first. But you must give to him first. And Elijah was teaching that to all of us. Behold, I stand at the door and knock, in Revelations chapter 3, verse 20. Behold, pay attention, he says, I, Jesus, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come to him and dine with him, and he with me. Just like Elijah came and let's just say there was a knock at her door, even though it was a call. Elijah wanted to come in and dine. And when he did, there was enough. Folks, if you'll let Jesus come in, he says, I love the word behold. It means pay attention, folks. Pay attention. I stand at the door and I'm knocking. If you have shut the door like that widow woman said I'm going to do, she said, I'm going to go in here, I'm going to cook this up, I'm going to shut the door, and I'm going to cook this up, and we're going to die. She would have. But if she would do exactly what the man of God said, you give to me first, and everything else will be okay. Jesus said, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in with him and dine with him. And when you dine with Jesus, every word becomes the oil of what you need to get you through successfully. Not just a little bit, but I believe that they didn't just eat little cakes. I believe they ate until they were filled. And you can too, if you'll open the door, let him in. God sends the most unlikely resources. God bless you.
We hope you've enjoyed Kingdom Ministries with Reverend Dee Levens. For more from Dee, read The Long, Long Night, The Story of Destiny, and Echoes from God, a Christian study book for growing deep and strong in the faith. Connect with Dee and purchase her books at deelevens.com. Send an email to deelevenstv@gmail.com or text Dee at 254-681-6099.